Um, so Wade, I wanted to start with you, but I'll probably direct questions. You guys can jump in. As we've seen, this kind of teaching is really hard work. It takes a lot of forethought, and it's tough. So how do we know that putting the time and energy into culturally responsive teaching will be worthwhile? I mean, we're in a time when teachers are facing so many demands for school improvement.
Oh, start out with a tough question, huh? Okay. I guess the short story would be that the evidence that I'm persuaded by suggests that if we're serious about raising achievement for all students, but in particular raising them more steeply from students of color, so that the achievement gap is closed not just by bringing up black and brown kids, for example, to the level of their white counterparts, but where all kids are getting better, but at the same time, the improvement slope for, let's say, black and Latino kids is more steep, then the key ingredient is getting students actively engaged in the learning process. Engagement itself is multifaceted. It involves cognitive engagement, behavioral engagement, and also affective motivational engagement. Engagement is the bellwether to higher levels of achievement that are also gap closing. And the evidence clearly suggests that the kinds of strategies that we heard about in the videotapes, saw in the videotapes, and the conversation that just went on are the kinds of techniques and strategies that enhance engagement, leading to enhanced achievement and gap closing outcomes.
Genevieve, you're here representing the department today, and the administration often calls these kinds of issues civil rights issues, educational issues, civil rights issues. How specifically is culturally responsive teaching a civil rights issue? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Definitely. As a teacher who uses culturally responsive teaching and pedagogy, it's completely a civil rights issue. And I know that our president and our Secretary of Education have said multiple times that education is the civil rights issue of our generation. And so thinking about access and giving kids a place to come where they feel safe and they feel comfortable goes back to so much of that relationships that you were just speaking about, Wade. And for many kids and many of our most struggling students, school is not a place that is seen as a place that you necessarily want to go because you either don't feel successful or you don't feel welcomed. And our families feel that way as well. So it's an issue that is definitely one around equity and creating an opportunity for all kids to come to a schooling where they feel safe and they feel supported and they actually then can learn. So I think it's definitely a civil rights issue and one all of our kids should have access to quality education, and that's not the case. And having more teachers with culturally responsive pedagogy and techniques can help bridge that gap and close it.
And Judy, you were an administrator. I mean, can you talk a little bit about, from the perspective of an administrator, what are the kinds of challenges principals have in making more teachers become culturally responsive?
Sure, I'd be glad to. I'd first like to congratulate the teachers that are here, and what a wonderful opportunity for principals to have a whole school full of you. While you're responsible for engagement and for learning in your classroom, principals are responsible for making those cultures all over the school. And you know, as hard as you work to get engagement and to become part of your students' lives and to become part of your school's lives, a principal needs to do the same thing to help support and make you feel welcome and to work with the kinds of professional development and the kinds of support that teachers need to do the things that you are doing. The culturally responsive classroom and the look at what we've been talking about in terms of test scores, and everybody has said what a wonderful surprise that after I have engaged students and made them part of their own learning, my test scores went up. Engagement is it, and it's not how much more time it takes you to do that. It's the smarter way to do it. And when you get the buy-in from principals, you have the number one impact with kids, and principals are number two. And creating that culture for the whole school means that that's what makes children successful. And that's when you start looking at test scores and engagement in the community and caring about changing your lives and moving in the direction of taking ownership of your own learning.
Building off this idea of leadership, in one of in the video with Katie, and they brought this up in the previous panel. A teacher said there's no achievement gap, there's a teaching gap, and I wanted to ask you, Wade. I mean, she said the onus is on teachers. Is the onus really on teachers, or is how much of the onus is actually on school leaders and district leaders and people above them? And you all can chime in too.
Well, certainly, schooling is a complicated process, and it is itself, one that requires multiple stakeholders to hold up their end of the responsibility. No doubt about that. We're talking about community stakeholders, parents and families, teachers, administrators, and of course even the students themselves. So there's no doubt about that. I would say, however, that ultimately the outcomes that we care most about are going to be either achievement outcomes or sort of life-enhancing outcomes for our students. And if you're looking at, for example, achievement outcomes in particular, then the evidence at least suggests to me that what goes on in the classroom between teachers and students and among students themselves is really where the rubber meets the road. All others are crucial, but when that door closes or that bell rings, whatever it might be, what happens inside that classroom on a daily basis is really the most crucial piece. However, I would say that to a large degree, it's really not so much about a teaching gap per se. And here goes my first shameless plug for my book. It's about an opportunity to learn gap. And when we think of it in those terms, students are learners to be sure, but frankly, all stakeholders should see themselves as learners. And so we have to enhance learning outcomes for teachers, administrators, students, parents, all those who are going to be involved in seeing our students reach their highest potential.
Go ahead,
I'll go ahead. Yeah.
All administrators in schools have an obligation to create the culture that's going to bring achievement to all of their children. And I need to go beyond just all. It's each student now. And to look at how kids best learn, to build capacity with staff, to look at how do I support teacher leaders, because as much as we want to look at the principle and the responsibility of where the buck stops, empowering teachers to be leaders in schools is a responsibility of an effective principal. So to look at how do I build strong connections with staff, and what kinds of things do I need to do to keep those connections going with young people, so that when you create that culture, you craft a culture for kids where they can use their knowledge in your classroom as prior knowledge and take that knowledge from classroom to classroom. So as you begin to look at how do we scaffold, for instance, in a high school where there are 10,000 unfamiliar words in a biology book, and that many in a geometry book, and many in social studies, how do we get together as a team and start building on the concepts, the interdisciplinary knowledge, and use that prior knowledge to support each other? That's the only way that we can get kids engaged in their learning. And as they learn, they don't stop in one class and not have it carry over into another class. So that teaming, that collegiality, we talk about it in ASSP and breaking ranks, that collaboration, the fact that we're looking at personalization and personalizing in terms of what are the learning styles of the young people that are involved, and then making those high expectations and setting those standards. And we've seen excellent examples of that today.
You want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I'm in a really unique situation this year because I am a classroom teacher who's spending a year at the department learning about policy. And something that I hear often, there is, some people may say there still is, and there was a lot of backlash against teachers, right? And that some teachers were not, we as teachers weren't meeting our kids' needs, and that's why our kids were doing so poorly. And I think the onus is on us as teachers, but the structures need to be in place for us to be successful. And so when I think about exactly what you're describing and working for school leaders and in school systems that provide all of those things that you just shared, allow teachers to do this work, because it is very difficult work, and it takes an environment, a safe and inclusive environment, so that we can examine ourselves to then work to help our kids examine themselves as well.
Go ahead.
I just want to pick up on that a little bit. The word culture has been used quite substantially today. And I want to speak also, at least briefly, about the notion of culture at the school level. The school culture really has to be impacted to create the kinds of situations so that effective teaching can go on inside classrooms on a regular basis. And in my work in school reform over the years, all too often schools, even with the best of intentions, have what I'll call blame culture in place. The fourth grade teachers are blaming the third grade teachers not getting the kids ready, or the middle school teachers are blaming the grade school teachers, or everybody's blaming the principal for things not going right, or the teachers are blaming the parents, and the parents are blaming the teachers. And I think that we have to get out of this sort of blame game and get into sort of taking collective responsibility game.
And who can stop the blame game? Who does the onus lie with there?
I would go.
All of us.
That's right.
Go ahead.
But I was going to say the culture itself is the first thing that the school administration needs to look at. Because if all students don't feel valued and all teachers don't feel as though they have input and engagement into the process, and parents and community, then what happens with that culture is it becomes inequitable. And young people are very optimistic and very focused around why did you let Johnny do this and you didn't let Mary do this, or why can't I do this and you let someone else? So that equitable look at what your culture should be in a school has to be a very focused and concentrated look of all of the people that are in the school.
And we're talking about ways, leadership can support the structure in school to allow this kind of teaching to happen, and obviously a major way is through professional development. So I'm wondering if, and maybe Genevieve, you can start on this, because I know this is something you said you've done, but I'm wondering, what does great professional development that's really effective in supporting culturally responsive teaching look like?
Our voice as teachers in that conversation, and thinking that so many of these decisions happen at the local level and the state level, and that we as teachers need to be in that conversation, but oftentimes we don't know how to be. And so I think part of the reason that it's not in the conversation is that, number one, it's kind of a scary topic, that some people are afraid to deal with it. And I think that some people don't value culturally relevant pedagogy because they don't see how important it is in terms of really getting our kids to engage in the curriculum and engage in their learning and then be successful. So those are things that we can change, and I think this award is something that actually really works to change that, to bring more light to the fact that culturally relevant teachers are incredibly important and producing student gains, but beyond student gains, giving students a schooling experience that they can actually relate to and change their own world with.
Judy and Wade, I mean, what would a perfect teacher evaluation look like in terms of culturally responsive teaching?
Well, I think there are a couple of things you need to look at, because it's not only just teachers whose evaluations are being looked at. It's also principals. And how do you come in and quantitatively and fairly look at a school and begin to say, how does that culture and how do you connect with your children make your evaluation as objective as it is and it needs to be. So I think that's probably the area that a lot of people are skirting around, that objectivity, that how do I show evidence of things and what's going on. And I think we've spent a good time looking at words like engagement, and our students participating, and have you started inquiry, and are you using higher level cognitive skills, and how is it, how can I now measure the kinds of things that you're doing? We're talking now about how do I make connections with students, and how can I use culture to celebrate those connections? And in cases where you have so many young people who are not in the books that they're reading, and who do not understand all of the processes that you're doing, or the languages, the vocabulary that you're using, the conversation becomes, what is the common thread that we can use to engage these young people in their own education? And that's where we come back to look at culture now is that common thread that everybody in that classroom has. And if the classroom is, there is no homogeneous classroom anymore. We need to begin to look at not just race. In the district, the ethnicity of my classroom was 100%. Where are you going to go in this country and become part of the workforce and become part of a team that's doing positive things, and be in a 100% African American environment, or a 100%. I mean, everyone's culture needs to be considered so that we can look at how do young people learn, and I think that's going to be the common thread.
So I'm being told it's time for Q&A already from the audience. If anybody has a question, go ahead and raise your hand, and there are mic runners, and just wait a second for them to come around to you. Do you have any questions? One over here.
Hi, I'm Marianne Woods Murphy. I'm working with Genevieve as a fellow at the Department, lifelong Spanish teacher. And my question is about student perception data. I'm really interested in the work of Ron Ferguson in Harvard, where they're looking at things like, is the student comfortable? Do you feel challenged in the room? And we're noticing that this sort of information also aligns with high achievement for students, but it directly, I think, relates to culturally responsive teaching. And I wonder if anybody has had experience with that, or if you think that kind of thing. Just asking our students, how do you feel? Are you challenged? Is the room a place where you feel safe and included? And having those numbers kind of connect. I'd be interested. Thanks.
I worked with a group looking at how do you do teacher observations, but only do them through the eyes of the students. And that's always a challenge, and you can imagine that was a thrilling experience that I had, but it was more, how could we now involve all of the adults in the building to help students see where they are and how they fit into the continuum. When kids come into the cafeteria, the administrators are, well, what did you do in your classroom? Now we know there were teachers that were saying, she's going to ask you how you did in your class. So you say, this is the objective. But in knowing how engaged you are in your classroom is an excellent way to begin to look at learning and how students embrace their own learning. So in carrying on those conversations and not doing that drive-by professional development, we begin the conversation. The challenge is, how do you continue the conversation? And getting young people's look at what's going on in the classroom, how engaged they are with what's happening, who, as an adult, is fearful of, I'm questioning what it is that you're saying. And we have a lot of young people that will ask, and we have anyone who looks at technology and says, all right, I got an iPad, let me find a teenager. We want to look at how do we do the things that kids do well. And there are times when we can celebrate that we can say as teachers, oh, you're doing a great job at that. You're much better at it than I am, without me feeling as though the throne that I'm sitting on is becoming frayed. And it goes all the way up. It's teachers, it's principals, it's assistant principals. How do we value what young people know and what their experiences are? And that very much is a part of evaluation.
You have another question? Oh, sorry, Wade.
That's okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about how culturally responsive teaching has to do with taking kids' lived experiences outside of school, outside of the classroom, and bringing them into the classroom. And I think the question that was just raised sparks in me the reality, something that I know our own work is focusing on more so now, and that is what is the child or the student's lived experiences like inside the classroom? Do you understand it from the student's perspective? And some of the factors that seem to be bubbling up as important are things like relational trust. Do you feel trust? Do you feel like you can be trusted, or that people can trust you, or you can trust the adults in the room? Another is mattering. Do you feel like you really matter in the classroom, or are you simply just like a bystander to what's happening inside the room? Do you feel like your voice is being heard and that your comments are taken seriously? There's also work around in psychology, motivational psychology, around notions of goal structure. And the two goal structures that are talked about the most are performance goal structures and mastery goal structures. And performance goal structures tend to be the ones most often seen. And it's about you're learning. The purpose of learning is to be the best student, to get the goal started, get your name on the board, to beat out the rest. Um, Mastery goal structures have more to do with in the classroom. The focus is more so on understanding, on effort, and on improvement. And the data show that in classrooms where there's mastery goal structures in place, kids feel more self-efficacious, particularly kids of color, and also that there's less behavioral disruption and consequently more engagement. In more performance goal structured classrooms, you tend to find more negative emotional tone in the classroom and more sort of let's call them toxic peer relationships. Like we're all trying to elbow each other out to get to the teacher's favor and the like. So this issue is one, I'm glad you brought it up, that I think needs more attention. What is the lived experience like for our students, particularly students of color, inside classrooms?
Got a question back here?
Good afternoon. I'm Denise Alston with the National Education Association, and I'm really thrilled to see this conversation going on. My question is, what's the role of family and communities in helping to develop culturally responsive teachers? And I'm sorry if you already, if the panels have already addressed this, but I'm just curious, how do you see family and community engagement as a resource for this effort?
I'm glad you asked that. I didn't get there. So.
Critical resource. If you're talking about culture and you're talking about connections that young people are involved with, then you're automatically talking about their family, and you're talking also about their community and what's important to the community. As administrators, we have PTA meetings and discussions with the community and looking at their assets and their resources. The school, in many cases, is the diamond in the neighborhood. And the question becomes, how can we better use those assets to provide resources for our young people? We can't do what business does in the school level, but you can go to business and you can go to your community resources and begin to use those in curriculum to better prepare young people. So I think the community and family are certainly one of the major contributors.
And just to add to that, in in my experience, I've taught in many different schools, and in one of my school communities, we were talking about this a little earlier at lunch, that some of the teachers at my school would just come off the train and go straight to the school and then go straight back home, and they weren't aware of all the amazing community resources, because our community was kind of maybe seen from like a deficit model. And so a parent who worked at our school and myself got together and we said, there's a million community resources here, and we talked to our principal and decided that we needed to create for all new teachers and all returning staff a scavenger hunt in the community, right, where you could go out and you had to find these 10 things and talk to these 10 people and go and visit the Point CDC and their amazing programs, and go and visit Sustainable South Bronx, and figure out all these amazing resources that are there. And so I think there's things that we can do at the school level, and then I think of things now at the federal level around initiatives like Promise Neighborhoods that the department has created, to really get community groups working together to think about and get them linked to create that web. And families play a huge part in that, right? And creating those systems so that kids don't fall through the cracks and they can find people where they can create those relationships. And I just echo that families and communities are key in this work.
And just to piggyback on those comments, one of the things that we've been promoting in schools where we work is not so much parent training workshops, but what we call parent empowerment workshops, where parents become empowered to be informed advocates for their students inside schools. So a parent should be able to come to the school and look at a classroom and see, is there really good teaching going on here? Are these kids really engaged? And be able to know that and not just assume if everyone is quiet and sitting there like they're in cemetery plots looking at the teacher that, oh, great, this strict control is in place, whatever the case might be. It's also the case, though, that we tell parents that at this school where your child goes, these teachers here are, in so many words, culturally responsive. And when you come to a parent conference, they're going to say to you, parent, we really care about your child getting the best possible education, and I want to see your child reach the highest potential possible. So what can you tell me as this child's parent that will make me a better teacher for your child? And you, parent, have to be able to have some answers to give to that teacher. That's your responsibility.
Looks like we have another question from the live stream.
Yes, we just got a question in from Carol in our live chat, and she asks, how can we restructure our emphasis on curriculum and testing to make sure we have time to listen to our students and hear their voices?
And if any of the teachers awardees want to jump in, feel free as well. Does anybody want to tackle that?
I can always jump in with both feet. When you really begin to look at curriculum and what it is that you're teaching and the pressures of how much time do I have, is the rigorous curriculum that I'm teaching going to fit into the timelines, and culturally responsive teaching is sort of the shortcut to get there. It's a new way of thinking, and once you begin to think in that direction, you're making better connections with young people. Your content area is there, and if you have people that are competent in their content area, then how they go about making connections to young people to master learning better is much easier. So that time that you think that you are going to teach and reteach and figure out a way to come in with 4 or 5 different things, what you do is you really come in a smarter way, and you look at how can I better connect with young people, and how can I better respond to what they're learning. And the learning connections are much easier, and the timeline then is not lengthy. Instead, it's shorter.
Wade, I'm going to give you the last word on that.
I'll be as brief as possible. One of the concerns that I have is well-intentioned people looking for solutions to the achievement gap and looking for ways to really do legitimate school reform, I would hazard to say, are often barking up the wrong trees, or just not all the right trees. All too often what happens is what I'll call, we employ technocratic solutions for school reform. Oh, let's have a longer school day or a longer school year. Let's have smaller class size. Let's go to block scheduling. Let's get a new curriculum in place. And all those things are interesting, but you got to also take into account transactional solutions. And that's, I think, that part of what we've been a sub-theme of this discussion this afternoon. And transactional solutions have to do with maximizing the learning exchanges that take place on a daily basis between students and teachers and amongst students themselves. If I've got only 10 kids in the classroom and I'm toxic in terms of how I relate to those kids, I'm going to do more damage with 10 than I would do with 30. If now all of a sudden we got block scheduling and I have an hour and a half block, what do I do now? But if we take heed of things that we saw here, so for example, things like student discourse and student elaboration are taking place. That is discourse. It's not going to be so much teacher talk. I talk, you listen. You take notes. You spit back at me. You have more instructional conversations. You get students to discuss among and back and forth, like you saw in the videos, or the notion of student elaboration, such that it's not just I give you the right answer that's already been prepackaged for me to give you, then you nod your head. Students should be able to present and defend the answers that they give and justify them. When you see that kind of teaching and learning going on, you maximize transactions, and that's going to get, I think, more bang for our bucks than keeping to this carousel we're on about these technocratic solutions.
So I really wish we could continue this conversation, but we've run out of time, so I can't thank you all enough for being here, and thank you everyone for participating.
I know. We can still continue the conversation.
Absolutely.